In September of the year 1087, in a church in the Norman town of Caen, the most powerful man in Europe was being lowered into his grave, and the grave was too small. They had built William a fine stone sarcophagus, but the years had not been kind to the Conqueror's body. He had grown vast, and in the days since his death that body had swollen further, and as the bishops and monks tried to force it down into the coffin, it split. The stench that rose from it filled the church and drove the mourners gagging toward the doors. The priests hurried through the rest of the rite and fled. It was a squalid, undignified end for a man who had conquered a kingdom, and it was interrupted moments before by a local man who stood up in the middle of the funeral to shout that the very ground they were burying him in had been stolen, that this church stood on land seized from his father, and that William had no right even to the earth of his own tomb. It was, in its way, the truest thing said about him all day, because history remembers this man by the kindest word in the English language for what he did. It calls him the Conqueror. It remembers 1066, and the arrow, and the tapestry, and the founding of a royal line that reaches unbroken to the present day. What it does not say, or says only quietly, is how the conquest was actually done. The years of burning, the deliberate starvation of an entire region of England, 100,000 dead by one medieval count, a whole nation dispossessed and made foreign in its own land. This is the story of the real William Dawes, not the founder of the sanitized legend, but the man who took a kingdom by terror and could not, in the end, keep even the 6 feet of ground they tried to bury him in. Everything William became, the ruthlessness, the iron will, the absolute conviction that the world belonged to whoever was most willing to kill for it, was forged in a childhood so violent that his survival to manhood was, by any reasonable measure, a small miracle. He was born around the year 1028 in the castle of Falaise in Normandy, and he was born illegitimate. His father was Robert, the younger son of the ducal house, who would soon become Duke of Normandy, a man history knows, tellingly, by 2 competing nicknames, Robert the Magnificent and Robert the Devil. His mother was a young woman of the town named Herleva, of decidedly humble birth. Her father, Fulbert, is described in the sources as a tanner, or perhaps an undertaker who prepared the dead. It was not a marriage. Robert never wed Herleva, and in the eyes of the church and the aristocracy of Europe, the boy she bore him was base-born, a bastard. It was a word that would follow William his entire life, thrown at him by his enemies as the deepest insult they knew, and it is no accident that the chronicles of his own age often call him not William the Conqueror, but William the Bastard. He was marked from birth by a stain that, in that world, no achievement could ever quite wash out. He would spend the rest of his life making men regret ever mentioning it. For a few years, his childhood was secure enough. His father acknowledged him, kept him close, and seems to have been genuinely fond of the boy. But in 1035, Duke Robert did a strange and pious thing. He announced that he would go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. His barons were appalled. Normandy was a violent, unstable duchy, and Robert had no legitimate heir, only this one small, illegitimate son. If Robert died on the road, they warned him, there would be chaos. Robert's answer was to gather his lords and make them swear allegiance then and there to the boy, to recognize William, this child of 7 or 8 years old, as the heir to the Duchy of Normandy. Reluctantly, they swore. And then Robert rode east, and on the journey home from Jerusalem in the autumn of 1035, he sickened and died. And so a boy not yet 10 years old became Duke of Normandy, one of the greatest titles in France, in a land where power was settled by the sword, surrounded by grown, armed, ambitious men who had sworn him an oath they had no intention of keeping. What followed were the darkest years of his life, and they would shape him more than anything that came after. The great magnates of Normandy looked at the child duke and saw not a lord to be served, but a prize to be seized, a puppet to be controlled, or an obstacle to be removed. The duchy dissolved into private war. Castles rose without license. Barons settled their quarrels with fire and murder, and around the boy himself the killing came terribly close. The men appointed to protect him, his guardians, his stewards, his tutors, began to die. One of his guardians was murdered, then another. His steward was killed. On at least one occasion, an assassin cut the throat of a man sleeping in the very room where the young duke lay, so close that the child could have reached out and touched the dying. His own great-uncle, who tried to shelter him, was poisoned. William was moved from hiding place to hiding place, spirited away in the night by the few men still loyal to him. A small, watchful, silent boy passed from hand to hand through a landscape of assassination, never certain, on any given night, whether the men in the next room were his protectors or his killers. Imagine what that does to a child. Imagine learning before you are 10 years old that every adult around you is calculating your death, that affection is a mask, that the man who smiles at your table may be the one who cuts your guardian's throat before dawn. Most children in such a position simply died, and many of William's would-be protectors did, precisely because they stood too close to him. But William did not die. Something in him, some combination of luck, of the fierce loyalty of a handful of protectors, and of a nature already hardening into something like stone, carried him through. He survived by learning to trust no one, to watch everyone, to read a room for the flicker of betrayal, and to understand, with a clarity that would have broken most men, exactly how the world worked. It was a brutal education, and he learned it perfectly. Because the lesson of William's childhood was not a gentle one. It was not that goodness is rewarded, or that loyalty endures, or that the strong should protect the weak. The lesson was simpler and colder than that. It was that power, real power, the power to live rather than die, belonged to whoever was most willing to use violence, and to use it first, and to use it without hesitation or remorse. The men who hesitated died. The men who struck first survived. A boy who watched his guardians murdered one by one did not grow up to believe in mercy. He grew up to believe in the preemptive blow, the total victory, the enemy so thoroughly crushed that he could never rise again. Every atrocity William would later commit, the mutilations, the burnings, the deliberate starvation of the North, is already visible in embryo in the terrified, watchful boy of Falaise, learning that the only safety in this world is to be the most dangerous thing in the room. He would not be a duke, in fact, for many years yet. The wars for control of Normandy would rage through his adolescence, and more than once his cause would seem all but lost. But the child had already become the man. He had learned before he was 10 the single lesson that would build his kingdom and damn his memory, that power belonged to whoever was most willing to kill for it. And William, the bastard of Falaise, was prepared to be more willing than anyone alive. The boy had survived. That, in itself, was the first improbable fact of William's life, and the men who had failed to kill him in his childhood would spend the next 20 years regretting the omission. He grew to manhood in a Normandy that was a duchy in name and a battlefield in practice, a country where the writ of its young lord reached only as far as his own riders could enforce it, and where the great families of the West and the South still spoke of the bastard of Falaise as a temporary embarrassment to be endured until something better could be arranged. They had watched his guardians die. They assumed the ward would follow them into the ground. What they had not reckoned with was that the years of hiding had taught the boy the one skill that mattered in that world, the ability to look at a smiling man across a hall and know, with cold precision, whether that man meant to see him dead. For the first years of his adolescence, he was less a ruler than a survivor with a title, carried along by the handful of loyal men who had kept him breathing and by the fragile prestige of the ducal name. But a title, in Normandy, was not a possession. It was a claim, and a claim had to be made good in iron again and again, or it withered. The magnates understood this better than anyone, for they lived by the same rule. They raised castles without permission and settled their feuds with fire, and they measured the duke not by the blood in his veins but by the number of lances he could bring to a field. By the middle of the 1040s, the lords of the western districts, the Cotentin and the Bessin, wild country far from the ducal heartland, had taken that measure and found it wanting. Their leader was Guy of Burgundy, a kinsman of William's own house, a man raised at the ducal court and endowed with lands and castles by William himself, who now judged that his own descent gave him a better right to Normandy than the tanner's grandson could ever hold. Around him gathered the disaffected barons of the West, and together they resolved to end the question in the oldest way. They would take William while he slept, in the winter of 1046 or early in 1047. The chroniclers are not precise, and precision was not the age's habit. William was staying at Valognes, deep in the hostile country of the Cotentin, when the plot closed around him. Tradition holds that he was woken in the dark by a single frightened servant, a man who had learned what was coming and could not stomach it, and told to ride for his life. He did not wait for an escort. He did not gather his household. He went out alone into the night and rode south and east across a country where every castle might hold an enemy, fording rivers in the black, keeping off the roads, driving his horse through the hours before dawn. Somewhere near the coast, a lord named Hubert of Rye is said to have taken him in, given him a fresh mount, and sent his own sons to guide the duke by hidden ways back to the safety of Falaise. It was the flight of a hunted animal, and William never forgot it. But this hunted animal had somewhere to run, and someone to run to. He ran to the King of France. Henry I was William's feudal overlord, and for reasons entirely his own, chiefly the wish to keep any single Norman faction from growing strong enough to trouble him, the king agreed to come to the aid of his young vassal. It was the decisive alliance of William's early life, and in 1047 the two of them brought their combined strength against the rebels on the open plain of Valais-Dune, in the flat country southeast of Caen. The battle that followed was not a matter of maneuver but of weight and nerve, a grinding collision of mounted men on level ground. William was perhaps 19. He fought in the press himself, not as a banner to be guarded at the rear, but as a rider seeking out the enemy, and the sight of the bastard duke in the thick of the killing did more for his cause than any speech could have done. A rebel host in the end is not an army but a coalition of ambitions, and coalitions break. One of their number, a lord named Ralph Tesson, had sworn an oath to strike William down wherever he found him, and finding him, is said to have struck only a glancing, symbolic blow before wheeling his men back to the ducal side, his oath kept to the letter and his loyalty restored. The rebel line buckled, then dissolved. The fleeing men were driven back against the river Orne, and so many were forced into the water in their armor that the mills downstream were long said to have been choked with the dead. Guy of Burgundy escaped to his castle at Brion and held out for a time, but the rebellion of the West was broken. Still short of 20, William was for the first time master in his own duchy. He was, by every description that survives, a formidable animal of a man. The chroniclers who admired him, and they were Norman churchmen, inclined to flatter, describe a figure tall and thick-set for the age, powerfully built, with a voice that carried and a strength that became a kind of legend. They boasted that he could bend a bow at the gallop that lesser men could not draw standing on the ground. He neither drank to excess nor laughed easily. He was above all tireless, capable of holding an army together through the long boredom and hunger of a campaign, and then striking with sudden speed when the moment opened. These were not the qualities of a tyrant only, they were the qualities of a soldier of the first rank, and his contemporaries followed him not because he was loved, but because he won, and because he had shown them over and over that the alternative to following him was ruin. He set about making certain the duchy stayed his. In the aftermath of Valais-Dune, he lent his weight to the Church's truce of God, the peace movement that forbade private war on holy days and holy seasons, and he used it to bind the violence of his barons to his own authority rather than leaving it in their hands. He pulled down the castles men had raised without his license, and he learned, in these years, the lesson that would define him, that a lord who wishes to be obeyed must first be feared, and that fear was a currency he could mint from the very insult that had shadowed him since birth. Another man might have tried to live the taunt down. William chose instead to make the price of speaking it unbearable. The lesson found its clearest and coldest expression at Alençon. In the early 1050s, he was drawn into war along his southern frontier against Geoffrey Martel, the Count of Anjou, a contest fought over a handful of border strongholds that commanded the roads into Normandy. William was besieging the fortress of Domfront when word reached him that the town of Alençon, a little to the north and east, had gone over to his enemies. He broke off the siege and marched on it, and as his column came up beneath the walls, the townspeople did a thing that would cost them everything. They knew his wound. They had heard all their lives the story of his mother's people and their humble trade, and they set out to open it in front of his whole army. From the ramparts and the outworks they hung out animal hides and pelts, and they beat them with their hands and their staves where the advancing duke could see, and they shouted the old word at him across the ditch, the tanner, the tanner. They were laughing at the leather worker's grandson who dared to call himself their lord. What they took for sport, William took as a declaration of war upon his person. He did not rage and he did not withdraw. He stormed the place, and when it fell into his hands, he had the men who had beaten the hides brought before him, and he ordered their hands and their feet struck off. The chroniclers who record it are Norman writers, not his enemies, and they set the detail down plainly and almost without comment, as though it was simply the kind of thing that happened to men who mocked this duke. The maimed were left as they were, living proof of what the joke had bought, and the terror did precisely what he had intended it to do. The garrison of Domfront, hearing what had become of the men of Alençon, surrendered to him without another blow struck. He had discovered that cruelty, applied with deliberation and at exactly the right moment, was cheaper than a long siege, and outlasted any victory won in the open field. It was a discovery he would carry across the Channel 2 decades later, and England would learn it in its turn. It would be easy and false to make of all this only a monster. The same young man who maimed the mockers of Alençon was also the disciplined captain who beat the greatest powers around him when they turned on him. When his old ally, King Henry of France, grew alarmed at Norman strength and invaded the duchy in force, William did not offer him the pitched battle he might lose. He waited, he harried, and he fell on the French when they were divided and heavy with plunder, at Mortemer in 1054, and again at Varaville in 1057, where he caught half of the king's army strung out across a tidal ford and destroyed it while the king watched, powerless, from the far bank. The lesson of his childhood had hardened into a method. Strike when the enemy is weakest, strike first, and strike so hard he cannot rise. By about 1060, when both King Henry and Count Geoffrey were dead, the hunted boy of Falaise had made himself the most formidable prince in northern France, feared by his neighbors and obeyed at last by his own. He had built more than an army. He had built a machinery of control, a duchy in which one man's will actually reached the ground it stood on, a rarer thing in 11th century Europe than mere courage, and the seed of the governed state he would one day impose on England. The barons who had once thought to steer a boy now looked on him with a fear that served him far better than love ever could. And when he lifted his eyes across the grey water to the north, to the rich and quarrelsome kingdom of England, he saw a throne without a settled heir and a ruling house at odds with itself, the very conditions in which he had learned, from the cradle, to thrive. He had spent 30 years turning the accident of his birth into a weapon, and the men who had believed a bastard could be safely mocked had been answered one after another in blood. The boy who had been called bastard would spend his life making men pay for the word, and he was only beginning to learn how far he would go. Survival had made William a duke. Victory had made him a master, but neither had given him the one thing a man of his birth needed more than any other and could not seize with a sword, the sanction of blood. A bastard could conquer his own vassals and cow his own barons, and William had done both. Yet in the eyes of the great houses of Europe he remained a man without a pedigree, the grandson of a tanner playing at princes. To bind his line into the settled order of legitimate power, to give the sons he did not yet have a claim that no rival could sneer at, he needed a wife whose ancestry was everything his was not. He found her in the north, in the county of Flanders. Her name was Matilda, and she would prove to be the shrewdest alliance he ever made. Matilda was the daughter of Baldwin V, Count of Flanders, one of the richest and most powerful princes of the age, and her blood was an answer to every insult ever thrown at her husband. Through her mother, Adela, she was the granddaughter of a king of France and a descendant of Charlemagne himself, and through an older Flemish marriage, generations back, she carried, remarkably, the blood of Alfred the Great and the ancient royal house of Wessex, the very house whose kingdom William would one day take for his own. It was a lineage of impeccable antiquity, and it was precisely what the tanner's grandson required. At its foundation, the marriage was a transaction of prestige and position. Flanders gained a formidable son-in-law on its southern flank, and William gained the one commodity his whole life had denied him. But it became something far larger than a transaction, for Matilda was no mere ornament of descent. The chroniclers and the later tradition made much of her small stature. She was, they said, strikingly short, almost slight beside the heavy, powerful frame her husband carried. Yet every account of her life agrees on the quality that actually mattered, which was the strength of her mind. She was educated, devout, politically acute, and possessed of a will fully the equal of William's own. In a marriage of two such natures, one might have expected friction and rivalry. What the record shows instead is one of the most effective partnerships of the medieval centuries, and by a long distance the most stable and trusting relationship of William's violent life. It did not, if the most famous story is to be believed, begin gently. There is a tale, repeated for the better part of 1,000 years, that when William's proposal was first carried north to Flanders, Matilda received it with contempt. She would not, she is supposed to have said, stoop to marry a bastard. And the story goes that William, hearing this, rode to Flanders in a fury, found her, dragged her down by her hair or her long braids, struck her to the ground before her own women, and rode away without a word, whereupon Matilda, strangely, declared that she would have this man and no other. It is a lurid tale, and it has clung to their names like a stain for centuries. It is also, almost certainly, an invention. No contemporary source records any such assault. The story surfaces only in later, less reliable accounts, the work of moralists and romancers who found in the Great Conqueror an irresistible candidate for a legend of domestic savagery and duly supplied him with one. Weighed honestly, it belongs on the shelf of medieval myth, not on the page of history. What the actual record preserves is something the legend cannot accommodate: a marriage of unusual loyalty and unusual competence, a union in which William, a prince surrounded, like every prince of his age, by endless opportunity for infidelity, is not known to have taken a single mistress or fathered a single acknowledged bastard from the day he married her. In the 11th century, among men of his power, that was very nearly aberrant. Whatever else the marriage was, it was faithful, and it was faithful for more than 30 years. The union was not, however, permitted. Almost as soon as the match was proposed, it struck a wall of ecclesiastical stone. In 1049, a great council of the church at Reims, presided over by Pope Leo IX, forbade the marriage outright on the grounds of consanguinity. The couple were held to be related within the degrees the church counted as incestuous, though the exact kinship that so alarmed the bishops has never been satisfactorily established by anyone in the 1,000 years since. It may have been a genuine and distant blood tie. It may have been a matter of high politics, dressed in the language of canon law, Flanders and Normandy grown too strong for a nervous church to bless their joining. Whatever its true root, the prohibition was real, and it hung over the couple with the standing threat of excommunication. They married anyway. Somewhere around 1051 or 1052, in open defiance of the papal ruling, William took Matilda to wife, and for the better part of a decade the two of them lived as husband and wife beneath a ban they simply refused to obey. It was of a piece with everything else in William's character, the flat refusal to accept that any authority, spiritual or temporal, stood above his own purposes when those purposes were fixed, and it revealed the same iron running through Matilda. Neither of them was inclined to surrender a dynasty because distant bishops disapproved of the paperwork. The reconciliation, when at last it came, was not an apology, it was a purchase. The man who brokered it was Lanfranc, the brilliant Italian scholar who was prior of the Abbey of Bec, a churchman who had at first opposed the marriage and then, won over, became its most effective advocate at the papal court. The beginning of a partnership between William and one of the finest minds in Europe that would shape the rest of both their lives. Through Lanfranc's diplomacy, the ban was in time lifted, under a later pope, in return for an act of penance on a scale that only the very rich could even contemplate. William and Matilda would each found a great abbey in their capital of Caen. For him, the Abbey aux Hommes, the Abbey of St. Stephen. For her, the Abbey aux Dames, the Abbey of the Holy Trinity. These were not token gestures. They rose among the finest buildings in all of Norman France, monuments in cut stone to the legitimacy of a marriage born in defiance, and in the fullness of time, the very places where husband and wife would each be laid to rest. They gave their small daughter Cecilia to the Holy Trinity as a nun, a living portion of the family dedicated to seal the bargain. The dynasty had bought its blessing and paid in cathedrals. With Rome satisfied, the partnership came into its full strength, and its strength was considerable. Matilda was no cloistered consort, kept for show and childbearing. When William's ambitions carried him away from Normandy, and after 1066 they would carry him across the sea for years at a stretch, it was Matilda who governed the duchy in his absence, holding its administration and its restless lords together with an authority the barons accepted from her as they accepted it from almost no one else. She was crowned Queen of England in her own right in 1068. Tradition holds that it was Matilda who gave William the ship that carried him to the conquest, the flagship named the Mora, its prow bearing a gilded figure of a child pointing the way across the water toward England. Whether or not the detail is exact, it captures the truth of them. She did not merely wait at home for the enterprise to succeed, she helped to launch it. Together they built a family that was also a strategy. Matilda bore him a great brood of children, as many as 10 by the fullest counts, though the names and the number of the daughters are far from certain, and 4 of them were sons. Robert, the eldest, mocked even by his father as Curtos for his short legs. Richard, who would die young in a hunting accident in the forests of the conquered England. William called Rufus for his red face and redder temper, and Henry, the youngest, the only one born after his father was a king. The daughters were woven, one by one, into the politics of the continent. One of them, Adela, would marry into the house of Blois and become in her turn the mother of a king of England. Every child was an instrument, a claim, a bond, a thread in the web William was spinning across Europe. And here, in the very success of the thing, lay its slow poison. William raised his sons to be rulers, hard, ambitious, certain of their right, and he raised them in the shadow of a father who had made himself the sole measure of all power and could not imagine dividing it. He gave them his own iron and Matilda's cunning, and withheld the one thing that might have held them together, any true authority of their own, while he still lived. He built a dynasty, as he built everything, for total and undivided control, and total control admits no heir who is permitted to grow into a rival. The sons learned the lesson of their house perfectly, which was that power is never shared but only taken. In time they would apply that lesson to the man who had taught it to them. Matilda would remain, to the end of her life, the one restraint upon him, the single person whose word could still reach the cold place at the center of the man, the one hand that could still hold the family in an uneasy peace. But the boys were growing, and the eldest of them, Robert, was already chafing under a father who would hand him a title and no kingdom to fill it. The marriage had done everything William had asked of it, and then one thing more that he had not asked and could not undo. It gave him the sons who would carry his name into the next century, and it gave those sons a grievance that would one day put them in the field against him. The marriage would give him an heir to a throne he did not yet have, and sons who would one day meet him on the battlefield with swords drawn. By 1060, William was secure in Normandy, married into the oldest blood in Europe, and master of every rival within reach of his sword. A lesser man might have been content with that. But William had learned in the cradle that power left unpressed was power on its way to being lost, and across the Grey Channel lay a prize that dwarfed his duchy, the ancient, wealthy, and dangerously divided Kingdom of England. The road to it did not begin with an army, it began with a story about a promise, and the story is where the darkness of the conquest is first laid down, because almost everything the Normans would later say to justify what they did rests upon it. The crisis had been ripening in England for a generation, in the person of a king who had never been meant to rule. Edward, whom later ages would call the Confessor, was a figure of profound contradiction. He was half Norman by blood, the son of the English king Ethelred and of Emma of Normandy, who was William's own great-aunt, and he had spent the better part of 25 years in exile across the Channel, sheltered at the Norman court while Danish kings sat on his father's throne. When he came home at last, in the early 1040s, to take the crown of a country he barely knew, he brought a soul that was in many ways more Norman than English. He favored the Norman tongue and Norman men, he pressed Norman clerks and knights into the offices of his household, and in doing so he set himself against the one family powerful enough to make or break an English king, the House of Godwin. His most fateful failure, though, was not political but dynastic. Edward married Edith, the daughter of Earl Godwin of Wessex, and the marriage produced no child. Whether from piety, as the pious later insisted, or from cold estrangement between the king and the family he both needed and resented, the royal bed stayed empty, and as the years passed, the empty cradle became the central wound of the realm. There was an heir of the old blood, the young Edgar, called the Etheling, grandson of an earlier king, but he was a boy, untried and unsupported, and a boy was a thin reed in an age that settled its questions with steel. Into that vacuum of legitimacy, two very different men now advanced their claims. The Norman claim was a masterwork of political storytelling, and it is important to see it clearly for what it was. The story, as told afterward by the writers loyal to William, chiefly the chaplain William of Poitiers and the monk William of Jumièges, was this: that around 1051, in a year when the house of Godwin had quarrelled with the king and been driven for a time into exile, Edward the Confessor had looked across the sea to his Norman cousin and promised him the succession to the English crown. It is a claim of enormous convenience. It transforms William at a stroke from a foreign invader into a rightful heir denied his due, a wronged kinsman come to collect what a king had freely given, and it rests, from beginning to end, on Norman testimony alone. No English source records the promise. No English source records the visit at which it was supposedly made. It may hold a kernel of truth. Edward, raised among Normans and childless, might well have dangled the succession before his cousin in a difficult year, but a spoken promise, made in private and remembered only by the party it benefited, is a fragile thing to hang a conquest upon. For the English saw the matter altogether differently, and their view rested on something firmer than a rumor of a private word. In the English tradition, the throne was not a possession to be willed away in a whispered conversation between cousins. It was a trust, and the right to bestow it belonged to the kingdom itself, to the Witan, the council of the great men of the realm, who weighed the claimants at a king's death and chose. And there was, in England, one claimant who towered over all the rest. Harold Godwinson was the most formidable man in Britain. As Earl of Wessex, the title he took up on his father's death in 1053, he controlled the rich heart of the country, and in the years that followed he made himself, in all but name, the ruler of England. He was not of royal blood, and he never pretended to be. He was something the age valued more: a proven war leader and a capable governor, the man who had broken the power of the Welsh prince Gruffudd in a hard campaign, who kept the peace of the realm when the aging king withdrew into his devotions, who was already doing the work of a king in everything but the crown. To the English nobility, weighing their choices, the question answered itself. They did not want a Norman master who spoke no English and coveted their lands for his followers. They wanted the man who already held the country together. And it was around this same Harold that the Normans built the darkest and most useful part of their case. In 1064, or perhaps 1065, Harold Godwinson crossed the sea to the continent. Why he went, no one can now say with certainty. The English sources are silent, and the guesses range from a diplomatic errand to the freeing of kinsmen to a simple accident of weather. There is a real thread to the second of these. Two of Harold's own blood, a younger brother and a nephew, had been given up to the Normans as hostages years before, in the quarrels of 1051, and had never been allowed to come home, and a voyage to win their release would have been the most natural errand in the world for the head of the House of Godwin. If that was indeed his purpose, then he sailed to Normandy to ask a favor and found himself instead a guest who could not leave. Whatever his purpose, his ship was driven ashore in Ponthieu, and he fell into the hands of the local count, who held him for ransom until William, the count's overlord, intervened and had the earl brought to him in Normandy as an honored guest. For a season Harold rode at William's side. He campaigned with the Normans against the Bretons. The Bayeux Tapestry shows him hauling Norman soldiers from the quicksands beneath Mont Saint-Michel, and shows William arming him as a man arms his own follower. Then came the oath. According to the Norman account, before Harold was allowed to sail home, William required him to swear a solemn vow upon holy relics to support William's claim to the English throne when Edward should die. The Bayeux Tapestry sets the scene down with damning care, Harold standing between two reliquaries, a hand laid upon each, swearing before God and the assembled Normans. A later tradition, embroidered by the 12th century chronicler Wace, adds a detail almost too neat to be true, that the sacred bones had been hidden beneath a cloth and were revealed to Harold only after he had sworn, so that he might see too late the full and terrible weight of what he had bound himself to. To the Normans, that oath was the hinge of everything. It turned Harold at a stroke from a rival into a perjurer, a man who had laid his hand upon the saints and then broken faith with them, and it handed William the one thing every medieval war craved above gold, a cause that could be called just. We must understand this for exactly what it was, and the guardrail here is plain. There is no English confirmation that any such oath was ever sworn, nor any sign that Harold believed himself bound by one. And even if he did stand and speak the words, he did so as a stranger in a foreign court, a guest who was in every practical sense a prisoner, whose road home ran through his host's goodwill. An oath extracted under such conditions is worth little in conscience and less in law. But truth in the 11th century was very often simply the version of the story that outlived the men who could contradict it. William grasped that better than anyone. He understood that if he could persuade the Pope and the courts of Christendom that Harold was an oath-breaker, then his invasion need not look like the naked land grab it was. It could be dressed instead in the robes of holy justice, and the Norman writers say that Rome, persuaded, sent him a consecrated banner to carry into England. The story of the promise and the oath was not decoration upon the conquest, it was the conquest's license. So by the closing days of 1065 the two men stood locked in a silent duel across the water, each armored in his own certainty. William, the bastard who had survived the slaughter of his childhood, saw England as the final validation of a lifetime's iron will, an inheritance secured by a dying cousin's word and sealed by an oath on the bones of the saints. Harold, the pragmatic first man of England, saw his country as a sovereign realm that was not the confessor's to sell, and certainly not William's to claim on the strength of a ceremony held under duress on the far side of the sea. 2 men, 2 stories, 1 crown, and only one of them could keep his. There was a last irony in the timing of it. Edward had lived just long enough to see the great new abbey he had raised at Westminster consecrated in the last days of December, though by then he lay too ill to attend the ceremony he had waited a lifetime to witness. And then, on the night of the 5th of January, 1066, Edward the Confessor died, and the church he had built became, within the same week, both the old king's tomb and the place where his successor would be crowned. The long-dreaded moment had come, and the English record insists that, in his final hours, the old king reached out his hand to Harold and commended the kingdom to his keeping, a deathbed designation that, in English eyes, settled the question and overrode any promise the confessor might once have breathed to a Norman cousin. The council did not hesitate. Within a day they had gathered in London and raised Harold Godwinson to the throne, and on the 6th of January, the very day they buried Edward, they crowned him King of the English. It was a swift, deliberate, defiant act of a nation choosing its own ruler. When Edward died in January 1066, both men believed England was theirs, and only one of them was standing in England to take it. Harold Godwinson was crowned within a day of Edward's burial, and from that moment he was a king running a race he could not see the whole of. He wore the crown of England, but he wore it under 3 shadows at once. Across the southern sea, William of Normandy was already summoning his lords and calling in the debt of an oath. Far to the north, another and older kind of danger was stirring. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, the most feared warrior in Christendom, who had decided that England's crown was as much his to take as anyone's, and who had found an ally in Harold's own exiled and embittered brother, Tostig. And over the whole island that spring a comet burned in the sky for a week together, dragging its long tail of light across the dark, the thing we now call Halley's Comet, which the men of 1066 read, as men have always read such things, as a warning that a great one would fall. Harold did what a careful king could do. Through the long months of summer, he held the south coast, the fyrd of the shires mustered along the cliffs, and the fleet riding at anchor, all of it turned toward Normandy, waiting for the sails. It was, the chroniclers said, the greatest force gathered in living memory, and it waited, and nothing came, for the wind would not serve William. Through August and into September, the Norman fleet lay pinned in its harbours by a contrary northerly gale, unable to cross, and every day it lay there the pressure on Harold grew, because an army cannot eat air. By early September his supplies were exhausted, and the harvest was rotting in the fields for want of hands. He had no choice but to stand the fire down and send the fleet back to London. The southern shore, for the first time all year, lay open, and it was precisely then, with the coast bare, that the blow fell from the wrong direction. Harald Hardrada had come. His fleet, some 300 ships, had swept down upon Yorkshire, and joined by Tostig, he had smashed the army of the northern earls in a bloody fight at Fulford, outside York, and taken the submission of the city. The news reached Harold in the south, and he answered it with the astonishing speed that was the mark of him. He gathered his housecarls, the iron core of the English army, professional axemen who fought for the crown itself, and he drove them north up the spine of the country at a pace that still seems scarcely possible, near 200 miles in only a few days, sweeping up fighting men as he went. He fell upon the Norwegians at Stamford Bridge, east of York, on the 25th of September, and he caught them utterly unready, their armor left behind at their ships in the warm weather. What followed was a slaughter. Hardrada was killed, an arrow in the throat. Tostig was killed. The great Norwegian host was broken so completely that the survivors needed only a fraction of the ships they had come in to carry home what was left of them. It was one of the most complete victories in the whole of English history. It should have been the making of Harold's reign. But even as the English were burying the dead of Stamford Bridge, the wind in the Channel at last swung round to the south. William had waited for this through all the wasted weeks, and he did not lose an hour. On the night of the 27th of September, the Norman fleet put to sea, and on the morning of the 28th, it came ashore, unopposed, on the flat coast at Pevensey. There was no army on the beaches to meet it, for the only army that mattered was 300 miles away in the north, bleeding and exhausted from the fight of its life. William stepped down onto English sand. The story that has come down to us, and it is a story, told also of other conquerors, and we should treat it as one, holds that as he stepped from the boat, he stumbled and fell full length upon the ground, and that his men gasped at so black an omen, but that William rose with both fists full of English earth, and cried out to them that he had already taken seizure of the country with his own 2 hands. Whether he ever said it or not, it is exactly the meaning he wished the moment to carry. He had come to keep this land, not to visit it. He threw up a castle at Hastings and set his men to burning and plundering the countryside around, Harold's own earldom, both to feed his army and to bait its lord into coming to him. The bait worked, and it may have been meant to. Harold heard of the landing while he was still in York, and he turned his weary, victorious army about and drove it south again. Back down the length of England he had just come up, another brutal march laid on top of a battle. He reached London, paused only long enough to gather what fresh strength he could, and pushed on toward the coast. Some who watched him do it thought he moved too fast, that he should have waited for the full levies of the north and the west to come in, that he should have let William's foragers starve in a wasted land. Perhaps. But Harold had beaten one invader by speed and surprise within the month, and he meant to beat the other the same way. William, however, was no Viking raider to be caught sleeping without his mail. He was the most patient predator in Europe, and he was ready. He drew his army up on the ridge of Senlac near Hastings, and there, on the morning of the 14th of October, 1066, the two of them finally met. The English took the high ground and held it as the English fought best, on foot, shoulder to shoulder, a shield wall bristling along the crest of the hill, the great 2-handed Danish axes of the housecarls waiting behind a hedge of shields. It was a wall built to be immovable, and for most of a long day it was. Wave after wave of Normans came up the slope. Archers first, then the foot, then the mailed cavalry that was the terror of the continent, and wave after wave the hill threw them back, the axes shearing through shield and helm and horse, the dead piling on the churned ground between the armies. This was not the swift affair that most medieval battles were. It ground on for the better part of 9 hours, and for much of that time the day hung genuinely in the balance. Then came the moment that turned it. On the Norman left, the Breton troops broke and fled down the slope, and a cry went through the whole army that the Duke himself was dead. For an instant William's host stood on the edge of the same rout that had swallowed so many of his enemies, and here the discipline of a lifetime told. William tore the helmet from his head so that his own men could see his living face. He had, by the Norman account, already had 1 horse killed under him, and would lose others before the day was done, rode into the heart of the panic, and turned the flight around by main force of will. More than that, he read the lesson the broken flank had taught him. He had seen how the English, when a part of the Norman line ran, could not resist breaking their own wall to chase it down the hill, so he gave them the temptation again, on purpose. Twice more, by the Norman account, his horsemen feigned flight, and twice more portions of the English line surged out after them in triumph, and each time the fleeing cavalry wheeled in the open ground and cut the pursuers to pieces where they had no wall to shelter them. Piece by piece, the immovable shield wall was thinned and pulled apart and made to bleed away its own strength. By the failing of the light, the English line was worn to breaking, and it was somewhere in that last hour, as the wall at last gave way, that Harold Godwinson fell. By the most famous account, he was struck in the eye by an arrow falling out of the darkening sky. This is the image the Bayeux Tapestry seems to hand down, and it is the picture that has fixed itself in memory for 9 centuries. But it is far from certain. The tapestry's meaning is disputed by the scholars who study it. Some read the arrow-struck figure as Harold, and some read the man beside him, cut down by a Norman horseman, as the king, and the very stitches that show the arrow may have been altered by later hands who repaired the cloth. Another early source, a poem written close to the events, says nothing of an arrow at all and describes instead a party of Norman knights hacking the king down and mutilating his body where he stood. What is not in doubt is the outcome. Harold died on the ridge he had chosen to defend. His brothers Gurth and Leofwine died there with him, and the housecarls of his guard, faithful to the last man, closed around the fallen standards and died where they stood, refusing to leave the body of their king. Even in the dark, the killing was not quite finished. A body of Normans, spurring after the fleeing English, is said to have plunged in the gloom into a hidden ditch or sunken ravine and been cut down there by the last of the men they had been chasing. A small, grim coda that later ages remembered as the Malfosse, the evil ditch. But it changed nothing that mattered. When the sun was gone, the field belonged to William. The flower of the English nobility lay in the trampled, blood-blackened grass of Senlac, and the crown that had been fought for since Twelfth Night lay ownerless in the mud. William stood in the wreckage of the finest army England could field and looked out over the darkness, and with the absolute, dangerous certainty of the victor, he believed that a single afternoon had won him a kingdom. Harold was dead, his brothers were dead, the flower of English nobility lay on the ridge, and William believed he had won a kingdom. He was wrong. He had won a battle. Hastings did not conquer England. This is the thing the title hides, the fact folded away beneath the neat and famous date. History likes to collapse the messy years into a single afternoon, one battle, one arrow, one crown, passing cleanly from a dead king to a living one while a stunned nation bows its head. But that is not what happened, and William, standing amid the dead of Senlac, was among the first to grasp it. He had destroyed the one-field army England could put against him. He had killed its king and its king's brothers and the better part of its warrior nobility in a day. And still the kingdom did not surrender. It simply drew back behind its walls and waited to see what this foreigner would do and how long his luck would hold. For weeks after the battle, William waited for the submission that was owed to a victor and did not come. There was no procession of earls to hand him the keys of the realm, no formal bending of the great men to the man who had won the crown by right of arms. Instead, in London, the surviving leaders of England did the opposite of surrender. They chose another king. They raised up young Edgar the Etheling, the last male of the old royal house, and rallied around him the archbishops and what remained of the northern earls. The city was strong, its walls were sound, and the temper of its citizens was defiant. William found himself not the master of a conquered country, but the commander of a tired, outnumbered army of foreigners, shivering through the English autumn, holding little more than the mud beneath their own boots, ringed about by a population that saw them not as rightful lords, but as a thieving plague washed in on the tide. So William did what William did. He did not throw his exhausted army against the walls of London in a single desperate assault. He set out instead to teach the country that resistance was not merely useless, but fatal, and he taught it in fire. He marched his army in a long, deliberate, burning arc around the capital, south of the Thames and then west, up the valley, crossing the river at Wallingford, swinging north to Berkhamsted, and everywhere the column passed, the villages burned, the granaries were emptied or torched, and the cattle were driven off or slaughtered in the fields. He was not fighting an army now. There was no army left to fight. He was strangling a city by devouring the country that fed it, drawing a ring of ash and hunger around London until the men inside it could see the smoke of their own supplies going up on every horizon. It did not take long. Before the year was out, the nerve of the English leaders broke. Edgar the Etheling, the archbishops, the earls of the north, one by one they rode out to Berkhamsted, and there they submitted and offered William the crown they had denied him for 2 months. The crowning came on Christmas Day of 1066 in Edward the Confessor's own new abbey at Westminster, and it was a fitting overture to everything that followed, because it turned to violence and terror before the rite was even finished. The church was packed with the great men of both peoples. Norman and English crowded uneasily together under one roof, and as the ceremony reached its height, the congregation was asked, in the two tongues of the new kingdom, to acclaim their king. They shouted their assent, and the shout was the undoing of the day. The Norman guards posted outside the abbey, strung tight with the nerves of an occupying army in a hostile city, heard the sudden roar of many voices from within the walls, and took it not for a cheer but for the opening of a massacre. They did not wait for orders, they did not go to look. They did what frightened armed men do, and they set fire to the buildings around the abbey. The flames caught in the dry winter timber and spread, and the smoke rolled toward the church, and the great congregation broke and fled the coronation in a trampling panic, while inside, before the altar, the new King of England was left almost alone with a handful of terrified clergy to finish the sacring of his crown. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis, who set the scene down long afterward, says that even William trembled. A reign that had been bought with fire was consecrated in it. But the crown on his head changed less than the ceremony pretended. William was now, in law and in the sight of the church, the king of the English. In fact, he was a foreign soldier holding down a country that had not the smallest intention of staying held. What the songs would later call the conquest was not a battle and not a coronation. It was a war. A grinding 5-year war of subjugation that ran from the moors of the north to the marshes of the fens to the deep valleys of the west, and William would spend those years almost permanently in the saddle, riding from one rising to the next, never quite done. He crossed back to Normandy in triumph in 1067, taking the great men of England with him as ornaments and hostages, and left the government in the hands of his half-brother Odo, the Bishop of Bayeux, and his closest companion William Fitzosborne. And the harshness and the greed of the men he left behind, seizing land, throwing up castles, treating the English as a conquered stock to be worked and milked, lit fires faster than he could stamp them out. The risings came year upon year, and from every quarter. The West rose first. Exeter shut its gates against him in the winter of 1068, and he sat down before the city and besieged it until it yielded, and set a castle over it to keep it quiet. The sons of the dead Harold came raiding out of Ireland onto the western coast. The old earls of the north, Edwin and Morcar, rose in 1068 and were beaten back into submission before they could bring him to battle, and William marched north for the first time and planted his castles at York and along the roads that ran to it, sinking his fists of timber into the country he meant to hold. And through it all, William built. This was his true and lasting signature upon the land, not the battles, which faded, but the castles, which did not. He threw them up across England by the score, and they were not built to shelter the people from any enemy. They were built to hold the people down. Each one was a fist of earth and timber, and later of stone, driven into the heart of an English town, often with English houses pulled down by the fistful to clear the ground for it, and garrisoned with foreign soldiers, who answered to no one the townsfolk knew. To see a mortar rising raw and new above your rooftops was to understand, without a word being spoken, that the land beneath your feet had changed owners, and that the new owner did not mean to leave. Yet the more he pressed, the harder the North set itself against him, and the North was a different country from the soft South. It was a land of long memories and old Scandinavian blood, tied by kinship and trade to the Danish and Norwegian kings across the sea, and it had never truly felt itself part of the England that was ruled from Wessex, let alone the England that was now ruled from Normandy. It regarded William not as its king but as its affliction, and it waited for its moment. In the beginning of 1069 that moment seemed to come. William had sent a newly made Norman earl, Robert de Comines, north to take Durham in hand, and he entered the city in the first days of the year with a body of several hundred soldiers, and let them behave as the Normans had learned to behave, and the men of the north rose in the night and fell upon them in the narrow streets and butchered nearly everyone, the earl himself cut down or burned in the house where he had lodged. The killing spread like fire on dry grass. The rising swept south to York, and it did not come alone, for now the last piece fell into place, the thing William had feared above all others. A great Danish fleet came over the sea, hundreds of ships sent by the King of the Danes to press his own family's ancient claim to England, and it made straight for the Humber and joined hands with the northern rebels and with Edgar the Etheling, the boy king who would not stay beaten. Together they came against York, where William held the city with 2 new castles and a strong garrison, and they overwhelmed it. The Norman defenders were cut down almost to a man. The sources speak of many hundreds slain, the streets of the city choked with the bodies of William's soldiers, the castles taken and thrown down. It was the single greatest disaster of William's reign, and the whole of the north was aflame with it, and behind the smoke stood a Danish army and a rival king. William was in the west when the news reached him, and the sources say that for once his iron self-command deserted him, that he flew into a rage such as those around him had never seen, and swore by the splendor of God to be avenged. He had spent 3 years trying to rule England as a king, by oath and by garrison, and by the slow pressure of the castle. He had shown mercy where mercy might buy peace, and taken submissions and let beaten men live. And it had bought him nothing but this: his soldiers dead in the gutters of York, his authority in the north wiped away in a single winter, a foreign fleet in his rivers, and a Saxon boy raised again as king. He would not make that mistake a 4th time. The lesson of his whole life, learned in the murderous nights of his childhood, rose up in him with a terrible clarity, that the only safety lay in a blow so total that the enemy could never rise to strike again. And when the North rose one final time and slaughtered his men in the streets of York, William resolved on a punishment that would end all rebellion forever by ending the North itself. The North had answered him at last, and the answer was blood in the streets of York. In the autumn of 1069, a great Danish fleet came up the Humber, sent by the King of Denmark, who had never surrendered the old Scandinavian claim to England, and it found a country ready to rise. Around it gathered the last hopes of English independence: Edgar the Etheling, the boy in whose veins ran the ancient royal line of Wessex, the surviving northern earls, and the men of Yorkshire, who had never in their hearts accepted the foreign duke crowned 3 winters before at Westminster. Together they fell upon York, stormed its 2 new castles, and cut the Norman garrison down to the last man, by one account some 3,000 of them, butchered in a single day. For a moment, in that cold autumn, it must have seemed to the English that the conquest could be undone, that the Normans could be driven back into the sea that had carried them. It was not the first time the North had shown its teeth. The province had risen against him again and again, a slow, stubborn refusal that no victory seemed to settle. Only months before, in the depth of the previous winter, the Northumbrians had trapped William's newly installed Earl, Robert de Comines, inside Durham, and slaughtered him and his men in the streets and burned him alive in the bishop's house. Each time William had answered, and each time the North had swallowed his answer and risen again. He was learning, in that country of moor and hard weather, the lesson his own childhood had already taught him in Normandy, that a threat left half-crushed does not die, but waits. The sources agree on his reaction to the fall of York, and the word they reach for is fury, a rage so total that it frightened the men around him. He rode north through the freezing dark faster than an army had any right to move, and somewhere on that road William made a decision that would stain his name for as long as it is spoken. He would not defeat the North again. He would end it. He was too shrewd a soldier to fight the whole coalition at once. He came first for the Danes, and rather than face them in open battle, he did what he had done so often before. He bought them. A great weight of silver was quietly agreed, and the fleet that had promised to restore English freedom took the king's money, withdrew to its ships to winter on the Humber, and in the spring sailed home. The northern rebels their foreign allies purchased and gone, scattered before him. He retook York, and there, amid the ruins of the city that had defied him, he ordered his crown carried up from the south, so that he might wear it at the Christmas feast of 1069 in the wreckage he had made, a deliberate, icy piece of theatre. And then, with the rising already collapsing and no army left in the field to oppose him, he began the thing for which there was no longer any military necessity at all. He turned upon the land itself. What followed that winter was not a campaign in any sense the age would have recognized. It was the systematic, deliberate destruction of a whole region's power to keep human beings alive. William broke his host into companies and sent them out across the northern shires with orders of terrible simplicity: to burn. They fired the villages and the halls and the churches. They burned the barns with the winter's grain still stacked inside them. They killed the livestock, the oxen and the milk cows, the sheep and the swine, not for meat, but to leave nothing breathing that could feed a family or draw a plow. They put the torch to the seed corn set aside for the spring sowing, and they smashed or burned the plows and the tools, so that even a survivor with the strength to work would have nothing left to work with. This was the cruelty folded inside the cruelty. To kill a man with the sword is to kill a man. To burn his seed corn in the dead of winter is to kill his children, and the spring that would have fed them, and the village that would have grown from that spring. The timing was not an accident. Winter was the weapon. A man burned out in October might live. A man burned out in the killing cold of a northern December, his beasts slaughtered and his stores in ashes and the ground gone hard as iron, would not. Nor did it stop at Yorkshire. When the eastern shires lay black behind him, William drove his army west, over the spine of the Pennines in the worst of the weather, through snow and flood toward Chester and the rebellious lands of the west, harrying Cheshire and Staffordshire as he went. It was a march so brutal that his own mercenaries, hard men from Anjou and Maine and Brittany, who had followed him for plunder, came close to mutiny, cursing the cold and the hunger and begging to be released from a king who would drive them across mountains in midwinter to burn a country already dead. He did not release them. The burning went on. Before it was finished, the devastation had reached across the whole of the north, through Yorkshire and up toward the valley of the Tees, into Cheshire and Staffordshire and Derbyshire and the borders of Shropshire, a swathe of country the width of England laid systematically to waste. Whole wapentakes were emptied of the living. Where there had been a settled, farming, tax-paying land, there was now, from horizon to horizon, ash and silence and the beginnings of returning forest. The chroniclers who set it down decades later still recoiled from it. Those who were not cut down in the first sweep of the soldiers wandered a blackened, frozen waste in search of food that no longer existed. The road south filled with refugees, and then with the bodies of refugees, for great numbers never survived the journey. Simeon, writing at the Church of Durham, recorded that between York and Durham, not one village was left inhabited, that the land lay empty and untilled for years, and that the rotting dead lay unburied in the fields and along the roads because no one remained with the strength to dig. The starving ate what could not be eaten, the flesh of horses, of dogs and cats, and the chroniclers report in horror, in the final extremity, the flesh of the dead. Men and women born free sold themselves into slavery for a single meal, surrendering their bodies and their liberty to any master who would give them bread, the last bitter irony for a people who had risen precisely to keep the Norman yoke off their necks. Far to the south, the monks of Evesham are said to have found their gates crowded with starving northerners who had walked out of the ruin, and to have buried many of them where they fell, too far gone to be saved. And here something remarkable happened in the record itself. Orderic Vitalis, a monk born in England to an English mother and a Norman father, who gave his life to an enormous history in which William is, again and again, the hero, reached the harrying and could not follow him into it. He had praised the king through page upon page, excused his hardnesses, admired his iron strength, but of this he would say nothing good. He wrote that he dared not commend so brutal and wholesale a slaughter, that William, in falling upon the helpless and the innocent of the north, had done a thing for which no cause could answer, and that for the blood of that multitude the king would one day stand before the judgment of God. It is a rare and telling moment, the sympathetic chronicler breaking faith with his own subject, unwilling to walk with him into the ash of Yorkshire. When the man writing the flattering history refuses at last to flatter, those who read him 1,000 years later ought to stop and take notice. How many died? No one can honestly say. Orderic set the figure at 100,000 dead of hunger, men, women, and children, and for centuries that number stood as the measure of the catastrophe. Modern historians are more cautious. Some argue it is impossibly high for the population the North could then have held, a piece of medieval hyperbole meant to convey a horror past counting rather than a true and reckoned sum. Others reply that the devastation was vast enough that no figure should be waved away. We will never have a census of the dead of that winter. But the quarrel over the number can quietly become a way of looking past the thing the number is trying to describe, and that we should not allow. Whatever the true count, 100,000 or half of it or less, the intent is not in doubt, and neither is the scale. The North was deliberately, methodically broken, and it stayed broken. The proof was still legible 16 years later. When William's surveyors rode north to compile the great inventory we call Domesday, they came to manor after manor in Yorkshire and found nothing to write down. No ploughs, no people, no value, no life. Against those entries the scribes set two flat Latin words, again and again, down the columns of the record. Vasta est, it is waste, not diminished, not impoverished, waste, worth nothing, holding no one. A great swathe of Yorkshire stood so recorded a full generation after the soldiers had gone home, the fields still unturned, the villages still unfilled, the silence still unbroken. It is the coldest verdict in the whole enormous book, and it is the Conquest's own record convicting the Conqueror in his own hand. He had achieved exactly what he set out to achieve. The Danes were gone. The northern earls had submitted or fled. The last great rising of the old English order guttered out in the frost and did not return. Never again in his reign would the North raise an army against him, and by the brutal arithmetic with which William measured the world, that was victory. He was not, we should be careful to say, a man who killed for the joy of killing, nor a monster raving in his tent. He was something colder and harder to comfort ourselves about, a supremely rational commander who had calculated, quite deliberately, that a country he could not trust was better made a desert than left to be governed, and who was willing to pay for his peace in the only currency that would buy it, the dead. That is the man the title Conqueror conceals. Not a berserker in a battle fury, but a mind that could set 100,000 lives against a single winter's security, weigh the two, and find the exchange acceptable. And that is the more terrible thing to know about him, that the North was not destroyed in a moment of madness. He might afterward have repented, but chosen, soberly, and carried out as policy. He had broken the North so completely that it would not rise again for a generation, and he had shown England exactly what kind of king it had been given. The fires in the North went out, and in the silence that followed, William built, not churches to thank his God, though those would come in time, and not palaces to display his glory. First and everywhere, he built castles. To the England of 1066, the castle was a new and alien thing. The English had fortified their towns for generations, the old burghs behind their walls and ditches, places where a whole community sheltered behind a common defense. But the private stronghold of a single lord, planted in the middle of a town to dominate the people who lived in it, was a Norman importation, and William and his followers raised them across the conquered country with a speed and a purpose the English had never seen and very quickly learned to dread. The commonest of them was the motte and bailey, and its genius lay in how little it demanded. It could be thrown up in a matter of weeks by men who needed no great skill, only the compulsion to dig. A gang of laborers would raise a high mound of packed earth, the motte, and crown it with a timber tower and a palisade. Below and beside it they enclosed a courtyard, the bailey, behind its own ditch and fence. Stone would come later, for the greatest of them. What mattered was that a handful of Norman knights could hold an entire district from such a place within a month of choosing the ground, and the men who dug them were very often the English themselves, conscripted, driven to the labor, made to break their own soil and pile up the earthworks from which armored foreigners would rule them. There was a bleak justice in the arrangement, whether William designed it so or not. The conquered raised the instruments of their own subjection, one spadeful at a time. For these castles were built to hold the English down, not to keep invaders out. And that is the truth the romance of the castle has always obscured. They were not lonely watch forts on a threatened frontier. They rose in the very hearts of English towns, and to make room for them, William's men cleared away whatever stood in the way. 2 decades later, the Domesday survey still carried the arithmetic of that clearance in its dry columns. At Lincoln, 166 houses had been pulled down to raise the castle. At Norwich, at Cambridge, at Shrewsbury, at Gloucester and Wallingford, the record counts English homes destroyed so that a Norman keep might stand where families had lived. Each castle was a fist driven into the face of a town, where a statement in earth and timber, and later in stone, that the people living in its shadow lived there now on sufferance and at the king's pleasure. The building was not scattered or haphazard. It advanced like a campaign, because that is what it was. When the North and the Midlands stirred against him in the years after Hastings, William did not merely march to the trouble and march home again. He marched, and as he went, he planted castles behind him to hold the ground he had crossed, at Warwick and at Nottingham, at Lincoln and Huntingdon and Cambridge, and twice over at York itself, so that each expedition left a chain of strong points garrisoning the country in his wake. It was the deliberate architecture of an occupation unrolling shire by shire. A rebellion once raised would find the roads behind it already studded with Norman towers, each with its knights, each within a hard day's ride of the next, so that no rising could gather in one place without a garrison bearing down on it from another. In a single generation, the Normans threw up hundreds of these strongholds across a country that had known almost none. The map of England filled with them like nails driven into a plank. The garrisons that held these places were small, and their very smallness made them savage. A few thousand Normans, at the most generous reckoning, now ruled a native population of perhaps 1.5 million or 2 million English souls, and every Norman knight in every timber tower knew the odds against him. Surrounded by a people who loathed them, cut off in a hostile countryside where they could not tell friend from enemy because all of it was enemy, the garrisons lived in a permanent readiness for violence. They answered the first hint of trouble. A fire in a barn, a rumor in the market, a tax gatherer jostled, a word overheard in a tavern, not with the slow machinery of law, but with the swift certainty of the sword. Terror was not an unhappy by-product of the occupation. Terror was the method. The castles existed to make the English afraid, and the men inside them did their work. In London, William wanted something that could never be mistaken for a temporary thing. On the eastern edge of the city, hard against the old Roman wall, he ordered a great keep raised in stone, pale stone, much of it shipped across the channel from Caen in his own Normandy, under the eye of Gundulf, the Bishop of Rochester, who had a gift for such building. It rose slowly through the 1070s and the years after, and when it was finished it stood higher than anything near it, a vast, blank, whitewashed cliff of a building looming over the roofs of the largest city in England. Men came to call it the White Tower. It was not a home, and it was barely a fortress in any defensive sense. It was a warning made permanent, a thing the citizens of London would see against the sky every day of their lives and never once be allowed to forget. At Colchester he raised the largest keep of all upon the buried foundations of a Roman temple, and at Rochester another rose to command the road up from the coast, great blank boxes of pale stone, built to stand 1,000 years, and built, above all, to be seen. What William did at London and at Colchester in stone, he did across the whole country in earth and timber, 100 lesser strong points knitting the conquest into the ground itself, so that wherever an Englishman looked, from the fen country to the Welsh march, a Norman tower looked back at him. But William's hunger for control did not stop at the walls of towns. It reached out into the wild land, into the woods and heaths and moors, and claimed that too for his pleasure. He was a passionate hunter, as the Norman lords all were, and he set about reserving vast tracts of England as royal forest. The word did not mean woodland alone, it meant whole regions of field and heath and settlement placed under a separate and merciless code, the forest law, in which the deer and the boar belonged to the king and to no one else. To make his greatest hunting ground, the New Forest in the south, land was set aside, and, it was said, villages and even churches emptied of their people, so that the king might ride after the stag through an unpeopled wilderness. Within the bounds of the forest, the ordinary law of the land did not run. In its place stood a code of punishment so savage that it became a byword for the whole reign. The forest was governed by its own officers and its own courts, answerable to the king alone, and it grew until great stretches of England lay under it, not the wild margins only, but good land, common land, land that farming families had worked and grazed and taken their firewood and their winter meat from since before anyone could remember. All of it was now the king's game park, and the men who had lived on it became trespassers upon their own fields. A peasant who set a snare for a hare to feed his children, or loosed an arrow at a deer trampling his crops, was no longer a hungry man taking what the land offered. He was a poacher against the crown, and the crown answered such men with the knife and the branding iron. The men of the English church remembered it, and one of them wrote it down. In the obituary of William that closes the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's entry for the year of his death, the chronicler set beside the king's strength and his hard-kept peace a colder reckoning. He made great game preserves for the deer, the chronicler wrote, and laid down laws to guard them, so that whoever killed a hart or a hind should be blinded. He protected the wild boars, as he protected the stags. And then the line that has outlived every monument William raised: he loved the tall deer as though he were their father. A man might have his eyes put out for taking a single beast to feed his hungry children, because the beasts were the king's, and the king loved them better than he loved the men. The rich complained and the poor groaned, the chronicler said, but William cared nothing at all for their hatred, for they must all bend to his will if they wished to live, or to keep the land they held. The same chronicler was honest enough to record the other side of it, and so must we. Under William, he admitted, a man might travel the length of the kingdom unharmed with his bosom full of gold. No man dared do violence to another, however great the provocation. The peace the Conqueror kept was real, and after the murderous anarchy of his own boyhood duchy, he prized order above almost every other thing. But it was the peace of the drawn sword. He had made England quiet in the same manner the harrying had made the North quiet, by rendering the cost of disorder unbearable to contemplate. The order was genuine, so was the terror that purchased it, and the one cannot be pried loose from the other. Stone by stone and law by law, the country was being closed. The old liberties of the English be, the common woodland that fed the poor, the local custom, the ancient sense that a free man answered first to his own community and his own 100-court were being shut behind walls and hedged about with new and foreign penalties. The castles watched the towns. The forest law watched the wilds. And over all of it sat a king who trusted nothing he could not hold in his fist. He had remade the map of England into something nearer a fortress or a cage than a kingdom in the old English sense. The land itself was being remade into a prison, and the men who had owned it were about to lose it entirely. A change of kings was an ordinary thing. Kingdoms passed from one dynasty to another by conquest, by marriage, by the simple failure of a line, and the great families of a country usually survived the change unshaken. They bent the knee to the new man, kept their halls and their acres, and carried on much as before. That is what the English aristocracy expected in the aftermath of Hastings, and it is precisely what they did not receive. What William set in motion over the 20 years that followed was something for which the age had no true precedent. Not the replacement of a king, but the replacement of a ruling class. He did not merely take the crown of England. He took the country out of English hands altogether and gave it to his own. The measure of it is written into Domesday, and it is staggering. In the England of King Edward, the land had been held by many thousands of English thegns, a broad and rooted native aristocracy, great earls and lesser lords alike, whose families had held their estates for generations beyond memory. 20 years later, when the surveyors made their reckoning, that whole class had all but vanished from the top of the record. Of the men who now held their lands directly from the king, the tenants-in-chief, the couple of hundred families who between them owned the greater part of England, almost none bore an English name. A bare handful of native lords had clung to a place among them. The rest of the record, page after page after page, is a roll of Norman and Breton and Flemish names. Half the kingdom lay in the hands of perhaps 200 men, and a vast share of that in the hands of a dozen, William's half-brothers Odo and Robert, his cousins and his companions in arms, the men who had crossed the Channel at his side and come to collect. An entire native ruling order had been lifted bodily out of the land, and a foreign one set down in its place. It did not happen all at once, nor by a single decree, and that is part of what made it so complete. It happened revolt by revolt, forfeiture by forfeiture, until at the end there was nothing left to forfeit. In law, William held that all of England was his by right of conquest, and his by King Edward's bequest, and that every man who had borne arms against him at Hastings and after had thereby forfeited his lands to the crown. From that one principle everything else unrolled. After each rising he put down, the estates of the defeated were declared forfeit and parcelled out to his own followers, so that every English rebellion in the end fed the very Norman land hunger it had risen to resist. A Norman lord would step into the whole inheritance of a named English predecessor, his manors, his rights, his mills, and his men, as though he were the dead man's lawful heir, and the survey would note only that where such an Englishman had once held, such a Norman now held in his place. Rising by rising, the map was redrawn, after the first revolts, after the burning of the north, after the last stand in the fens, each time another great swathe of English land passed into foreign hands and did not return. What had begun as the confiscation of a beaten warband ended as the dispossession of a whole people. The English lords who had held that land met one of three ends, and none of the three was mercy. Many were simply dead, fallen at Hastings, where Harold and his brothers and the flower of the housecarls died in a single day, killed in the risings that followed, cut down or starved in the harrying of the north. Many others fled into exile and carried their swords to distant courts, and a remarkable number of them traveled the whole length of the known world to Constantinople, where the Emperor of the Romans kept a guard of axe-bearing warriors, and where landless Englishmen took service by the hundred, selling their arms to a foreign master half a world away from the country they had lost. And those who neither died nor fled endured the subtlest humiliation of all. They kept their place upon the land, but no longer as its owners. Domesday catches them in its columns time and again. A man who had held his manor freely in King Edward's day, now holding the very same fields as the tenant of a Norman lord, working the soil his fathers had owned outright and paying rent for the privilege. They had not been driven off. They had been demoted in their own country into the servants of the men who had taken it from them. The fate of the greatest of them tells the story in little. Edwin and Morcar, the young brothers who had been Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, the last great English magnates left standing after Hastings, submitted and rebelled and submitted again, caught forever between a king they could not trust and a people they could not save. Edwin was cut down by his own followers as he tried to flee north to Scotland. Morcar, taken at the final English stand, disappeared into a Norman prison for the rest of his life. That last stand came in 1071, in the watery fastness of the Isle of Ely, where a fenland thegn named Hereward and a band of the dispossessed held out among the marshes against everything the king could send at them, until William bridged and dammed his way across the fens, and the resistance broke. Hereward himself slipped away into the reeds and into legend, the last English hero of a lost cause. And when a final conspiracy stirred 4 years later, the reckoning was plainer still. The English Earl Waltheof, who had joined 2 discontented Norman lords in revolt and then repented of it and confessed, was arrested, held for months, and at length beheaded on a hill above Winchester. The one great Englishman, William, put to death by the axe, mourned by the monks who buried him as a martyr to his people. Even the old royal blood came to nothing. Edgar the Etheling, the boy who might have been crowned in William's place, lived out his long life a wanderer and a pensioner, and submitted in the end to the man who had taken his kingdom. Nor was it only the lords of the field. The English Church, the oldest and most venerable institution in the land, the keeper of its learning and its long memory, was hollowed out and refilled from abroad with the same deliberate thoroughness. Stigand, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was stripped of his office in 1070, and into his place went Lanfranc, a brilliant Italian scholar-monk out of William's own Abbey of Bec, who would govern the English Church henceforth as the king's man. One by one the English bishops and abbots followed Stigand out of their sees. Within little more than a decade there was scarcely a great cathedral or a great monastery left in native hands. The one conspicuous survivor, Wulfstan of Worcester, was remembered by name precisely because he was so nearly alone. The newcomers regarded the traditions they had inherited with a cool continental contempt, doubting the old English saints, purging the calendars of feasts they judged irregular, forcing new usages upon ancient houses. When the monks of Glastonbury resisted the changes pressed on them by their new Norman abbot, the quarrel ended with his soldiers loosing arrows in the abbey church and monks lying dead among the altars. The conquest had reached into the very choir, and in the quiet of the scriptoria a subtler erasure went forward. The old books in the English tongue were set aside to gather dust or scraped clean for reuse. The native histories were recopied to flatter the new order, and the memory of the English past began, page by page, to be rewritten in the language and the interests of the men who had conquered it, and it reached into the mouths of the living. French became the tongue of everyone who mattered, of the court, the law, the great households, the men who gave the orders and drew up the deeds. English, the language in which a sophisticated kingdom had governed itself and prayed and made its poetry for centuries, was driven down the social scale to become the speech of the ruled, the language of the field, the workshop, the kitchen, and the cottage, beneath the notice of power. For 300 years the master of the hall would speak one tongue and the man who served at his table another. It stands among the most complete cultural subjugations in the history of Europe, and it came about not by slow and natural drift but by the swift, deliberate substitution of one ruling people for another. Something of that division survives, fossilized, in the very words spoken in England today. The beasts in the field kept their plain old English names, ox and cow, sheep and swine, while the meat those beasts became, once it was carried up to the Lord's table, took the French names of the men who ate it. The Englishman raised the animal, the Norman dined upon it, and the two facts sit side by side in the same word hoard 1,000 years on, a small monument in the mouth to who had come to serve and who to be served. This is the part of the story that the word conqueror hides most successfully of all. We picture a battle and a crown passing from one head to another. The reality was the erasure of a nation's entire leadership and the reduction of its people, in law, in language, and in land, to a subordinate race in the country their own ancestors had made. To be English within 20 years of Hastings was to be ruled and to know it, to look up at every rung of power, from the lord of the local manor to the bishop in his cathedral to the king upon his throne, and to see a foreign face looking back down. And yet the truth is never only one thing, and both halves of it must be held together in the same hand. The very completeness of the dispossession made England, in a hard and undeniable sense, one country. There was now a single ruling class, bound to a single king, holding all the land on a single set of terms. Out of the cruelty came a unity, and out of the unity came the strong, centralized, formidable English state that would outlast every man who built it. It was a genuine creation. It was also raised on the wreck of a living people, and the people did not forget it. Within 20 years, England had a new ruling race, and the old one had simply and deliberately been erased. He had taken the land and given it to his own. Now he meant to count it. In the last years of his reign, William turned from the sword to the pen, and in the turning he created the single most extraordinary document of the medieval West, an instrument of government so far ahead of its age that no other kingdom in Europe would produce its equal for centuries to come. It was also, in its cold way, the final act of the conquest itself. The moment the seizure of England was written down, weighed, and made permanent in ink. The occasion was fear. At Christmas of 1085, holding his court at Gloucester, William faced the threat of yet another invasion, a great fleet gathering in Denmark under its king, who had not abandoned the old northern claim to the English crown. To meet it, William had brought mercenaries across the Channel in enormous numbers and quartered them on the country, and a king who must feed and pay an army needs to know, to the last acre and the last ox, exactly what his kingdom can be made to yield. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that at Gloucester that Christmas the king had deep and searching counsel with his advisers about the land, how it was peopled and by whom, and what it was worth. Out of that counsel came a decision of breathtaking ambition. He would have the whole of England surveyed, every shire, every manor, every hide of ground, every plough and mill and beast and man set down together in a single record. What followed through the year 1086 was an inquisition of an entire country. Royal commissioners rode out along fixed circuits, and in shire court after shire court they summoned juries of local men, English and Norman side by side, and put them upon their oath. Of every single manor they asked the same relentless questions. What was it called? And who had held it in the days of King Edward, and who held it now? How many hides of land? How many ploughs on the Lord's own domain? And how many among his men? How many villagers? How many cottagers? How many slaves? How much woodland and meadow and pasture? How many mills? How many fish ponds? What had it been worth then in the old king's time, and what was it worth now? And sharpest of all the questions, could it be made to yield still more? Nothing was too small to escape the reckoning. The commissioners wrote down the plough teams and the swine pastures, the salt pans and the beehives, the very cattle standing in the byres. The scale and the speed of it defy belief even now. In a single year, the commissioners quartered the whole country, gathered the sworn testimony of thousands of local juries, and sent their findings back to be tested, for a second body of officers followed behind the first, to check what had been recorded and to root out the concealments and the lies, so thoroughly did the king mean to be answered. The mass of returns was then digested and compressed by a single scribe's hand into the great volume that survives, shire by shire and manor by manor, in a script that scarcely wavers across its hundreds of leaves. Only the rich eastern counties of Norfolk and Suffolk and Essex, too detailed to abridge, were bound up apart and left unshortened. Between them the two books set down more than 13,000 places. Almost nothing slipped through, though the far north still lay largely beyond the reach of the assessment and faded toward blankness at the edges of the record, and the two greatest cities, London and Winchester, were somehow left out of the final reckoning altogether, as if even this machine had found its limit. But what it did reach, it held, and held forever. The Englishman who kept the chronicle watched this happen, and he was appalled by it. So narrowly did the king have the land searched out, he wrote, and the bitterness comes off the page 1,000 years later, that there was not one hide, not a single yard of ground, nor, it is a shame to tell it, though it seemed no shame to him to do it, so much as one ox, nor one cow, nor one pig left out that was not set down in his record. It is a small and unforgettable line. The chronicler's shame is not at the tax, nor at the labor of the thing. It is at the sheer, invasive totality of it, a king reaching his hand into every byre and sty in England to number the animals of the poor. To be surveyed like that, counted down to the last pig, was to be owned. The king's own officials called it simply the Book of Winchester, or the Great Survey, or the King's Roll. But the English gave it another name, and that is the name that has lasted. They called it Domesday, the Day of Doom, the Last Judgment, because, as a royal treasurer would explain generations afterward, its verdict was like God's own upon the last day, final, decisive, and beyond all appeal. There was no arguing with what stood written in that book. Whatever it said you held, you held. Whatever it said you owed, you owed. It was the last word upon the land of England, and the English named it for the end of the world. For that was the true genius of the thing, and its true menace. Domesday was a tax record, certainly, and it was a title deed to the greatest land theft in English history. The ledger in which every acre William had stripped from the English was now formally assigned to the Normans who had received it. But it was more than either of those. It was knowledge. Knowledge on a scale no ruler of that age had ever commanded. When it was done, William could know, could actually turn to a page and read what any manor in his kingdom was worth, who held it, and what more might be squeezed from it. No lord could now hide his wealth. No shire could plead a poverty the king's book would expose as a lie. It made the whole kingdom legible to its master as no kingdom had ever been before. It was surveillance 4 centuries before there was a word for it, and it turned England into the most thoroughly known, and therefore the most thoroughly governable realm in Christendom. It settled 1,000 quarrels over who rightfully held what, for the book's word was final and could be pleaded in the king's own court against any rival claim, and it fixed, manor by manor, the ancient land tax the English called the geld, so that no man might now underpay a penny of what the record said he owed. Knowledge was title and knowledge was revenue, and William now held more of both than any king in Europe. And having counted his kingdom, William moved to bind it fast to himself. In August of 1086, as the survey neared its end, he summoned the landholders of England to him at Salisbury, not the great magnates only, but every man of any account who held land, whosever man he might otherwise be. They came, and there they knelt, and there they swore. Each of them took an oath of allegiance to William directly and in person, swore to be his man against all other men, whatever lesser lord might stand between them. It struck at the deepest flaw in the feudal order William had known in Normandy, where a baron could raise his own vassals in revolt against the crown because their first loyalty ran to him and not to the king above him. William would not have England run on those terms. Historians still argue over how novel the Salisbury Oath truly was, and whether it worked the constitutional revolution that an older generation once claimed for it. But its meaning in the moment is not in dispute. Every man who held so much as a foot of English soil was made to acknowledge, upon his oath and upon his knees, that above his own lord stood the king, and that above the king stood no one at all. Set the two things side by side, the book that knew everything, and the oath that bound everyone, and the shape of what William had made comes clear. It was, by the measure of its own century, a masterpiece of government. No other medieval state came near it. Kings across Europe would have given a great deal for a fraction of the reach William now held over England, and the machinery he had assembled would outlast him by centuries and make of England a precociously strong and centralized kingdom. That is the achievement, and it was entirely real. But it was the achievement of a conqueror perfecting his grip. The same survey that was a marvel of administration was also the final inventory of stolen goods. The same oath that gave England its unity also chained a subjugated people to the man who had subjugated them. A great instrument of government and a great instrument of control were, in his hands, the very same instrument. Historians have called Domesday the most remarkable administrative achievement of the entire Middle Ages, and they are right to call it so. But it is worth pausing on what a survey of such reach is actually for, and on what manner of ruler needs to know the contents of every barn in his realm. The book stands as the proof of William's genius as a governor of men. It stands just as surely as the proof of how total and how watchful his hold upon England had been made to be. By the end of 1086, the work was, in truth, all but finished. William had beaten the English in the field, burned the north into submission, stripped the old aristocracy of its lands, ringed the country with castles, counted every hide and beast within it, and bound every lord in it to his person by a personal oath. The kingdom lay quiet and known and his, down to the last pig in the last byre. There was nothing left to take, and a man who had spent 60 years taking who had never once in his life known a peace that was not merely the exhaustion of his enemies, did not know how to live with nothing left to conquer. He turned at the last to the only ground still contested, the only people left who still dared to set their will against his own blood. He had counted every beast and bound every lord in England to his will, and he had, at last, almost nothing left to conquer, which left only his own family to turn on. By the middle of the 1080s, the man who had counted every ox and bound every lord in England to his person discovered a thing that all his machinery of control could not reach. He could not govern his own house. The iron will that had broken the Saxon nobility, that had burned Yorkshire into a wasteland still recorded as waste 16 years later, that had pressed the most exacting survey in Europe onto a conquered people, that will met, within the walls of his own castles, an obstacle it could neither survey, nor tax, nor terrify into obedience. It was the ambition of his own blood. He had raised his sons to be conquerors, taught them by his whole life that land was the only thing worth having, and force the only sure way to hold it, and now the lesson had come home. They were waiting for the old lion to die. The ambition had a particular shape, and its name was Robert. The eldest of William's sons, born to Matilda in the years before the conquest, Robert was a short, thick-set, open-handed man, genuinely brave in the field and generous to the point of ruin, and his father had marked him from boyhood as the heir to Normandy. He had also marked him less kindly with a name. The chroniclers say it was William himself who first called the boy curthose, short boots, short stockings, a mockery of his stunted legs that the whole court took up and never let go. It was a small cruelty, but small cruelties fester, for Robert was a man kept perpetually in the antechamber of power. His father had promised him Normandy and the county of Maine, and had made the Norman barons swear to him as their future lord. His father would not give him so much as a single castle to rule in his own right while he drew breath. When Robert pressed him for real authority, William is remembered to have answered that it was not his custom to undress before he went to bed, that he would not strip himself of his lands while he still lived to wear them. Robert was past 30, a grown man with the following of restless young knights, and he was still, in every way that counted, his father's ward. The break, when it came, began as something close to farce. Orderic Vitalis tells that, at the town of L'Aigle, Robert's two younger brothers, William, called Rufus for his red face, and the boy Henry, climbed to an upper chamber and emptied water, or something fouler, down onto Robert and his companions in the yard below. It was the sort of insult brothers have traded since the beginning of families. But in this family, the stakes were a kingdom, and it detonated. Robert drew his sword. The king had to be roused in the night to keep his sons from killing one another under his own roof. And Robert, humiliated, convinced now that his father would never loosen his grip and that his younger brothers were being groomed to leap over him, rode out of Normandy in open revolt. He did not lack for friends. Every enemy William had made in 30 years of war saw in the rebellious heir a blade to be turned against the old king's back, and the sharpest of them was Philip, King of France, who had long watched his overmighty vassal with fear. Philip gave Robert the border fortress of Gerberoy, a nest of stone on the very edge of Normandy, and from it Robert and his company of exiles and malcontents raided their father's duchy. And so, in the first weeks of 1079, William did the thing William always did. He came with an army to burn the rebellion out. What happened beneath the walls of Gerberoy was the one blow his enemies could never have engineered, and it broke something in him that no defeat in the field ever had. The garrison sorted. In the press and confusion of mounted men, the king was set upon by a knight who fought with a fury the equal of his own, and in the clash that knight ran him through the arm, cut his horse from under him, and put the old conqueror down in the mud. The blade was already lifted for the killing stroke, and then, the accounts say, the son heard the father's voice. Not a plea, William did not plead, but the roar of the king, and Robert knew it, and the knowledge froze his hand in the air. He had not known whom he was killing. He climbed down, gave his father his own horse, and let him ride wounded from a field his own son had won. It is among the coldest scenes in the whole history of the House of Normandy. The conqueror, unhorsed and bleeding, granted his life as a gift by the boy he had ruled and mocked and would not trust with a rood of ground. Some accounts add that an Englishman in the king's service, remembered as Toki, was killed in the same melee, bringing his lord a fresh mount, dying for a king whose own heir had just struck him down. Rufus, the favored second son, was wounded there too. William lifted his siege and withdrew, and for a season the humiliation seemed to set into permanent estrangement. That it did not, at least not at once, was largely the work of Matilda. Orderic records that the queen, grieving the rupture between her husband and her firstborn, sent Robert money in secret, out of her own revenues, in open defiance of the king's command, and that when William learned of it, his anger was terrible, and the messenger who had carried the silver was fortunate to keep his eyes. It is a narrow window onto the marriage and the household that the one person in Christendom who could cross the Conqueror to his face and survive was doing it to shield the son who had nearly killed him. Under her hand and under pressure from the barons and the church, a reconciliation of sorts was patched together around 1080, and William confirmed Robert once more as his heir in Normandy. But the wound did not close. Robert would be gone again before the end, drifting between the courts of his father's enemies, waiting. If his sons were unreliable, his own brothers were no better. Chief among them was Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, William's half-brother, born of the same mother, Herleva, raised to his bishopric as little more than a boy, and to the earldom of Kent after Hastings, where he had ridden into the battle carrying a club so that, as a man of the church, he might not be said to have shed blood with the edge of a sword. Odo had governed England as his brother's viceroy through the long absences, and he had grown monstrously rich doing it, the greatest landholder in the kingdom after the king himself, a prelate whose appetite had swollen to match his wealth. By the early 1080s that appetite had fixed on Rome. Odo meant, the accounts say, to buy himself the papacy. He had purchased a palace in the city, courted the Roman nobility with Kentish gold, and begun to enlist knights, some of them the king's own men, to follow him across the Alps. William struck in 1082. He seized his brother in person, and when the assembled lords hung back, for it was a fearful thing to lay hands on a consecrated bishop, the king is said to have declared that he did not arrest the Bishop of Bayeux at all, but the Earl of Kent, his own officer, whom he had every right to judge. It was a lawyer's distinction drawn by a soldier's hand, and it held. Odo was stripped of his English estates and shut in a tower at Rouen, where he would stay, uncondemned by any church court and unreleased by his brother, for the last 5 years of the reign. No one at court mistook the meaning of it. If the king would chain the brother who had stood beside him at Hastings, then no blood and no holy office was a shield. And then, in November of 1083, the last tether parted. Matilda died at Caen and was laid in the Abbey of the Holy Trinity that she herself had founded there. She had been far more than a wife to him. For 30 years she had ruled Normandy in his absence, borne him some 9 or 10 children, held the duchy steady while he took a kingdom across the sea, and stood as the single human restraint upon his nature, the one voice he heeded, the one grief he could not order away. The chroniclers mark a change in him after her death. The king, who had always been hard, grew harder. The cold discipline that had governed even his cruelty began to slip, and what showed beneath it was rawer and less careful. There had been other griefs to soften the ground. Years before, a second son, Richard, had died young in the New Forest. That vast hunting ground William had carved out of the South Country by driving whole villages from their homes under his forest law, killed in a riding mishap among the very trees his father had emptied of men for the pleasure of the chase. It was the kind of dark symmetry the age was quick to read as judgment, and he would live to see it come round again. His last years were spent, as all his years had been, in motion, but the motion had changed its character. He was heavier now and slower, his temper nearer the surface, moving from castle to smother one revolt, only to find another already kindling on the far border. The frontiers of his Norman lands would not stay quiet, Maine restless under his rule, the Counts of Anjou and Brittany watchful, the King of France forever probing the seams, and his own sons were threads in every plot against him, playing his enemies against their father, while his court sat thick with the flattery of men who were quietly counting the days. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, taking his measure, called him a man of great sternness, stern beyond all measure to those who crossed his will, while the poor groaned under him. He had made himself master of a kingdom and the terror of a continent. He had built in Domesday a monument to order that would outlast every wall he raised, but the order stopped at his own threshold. The man who had conquered a kingdom could not hold his own household, and grief and rage were making the old king crueler than ever. The body that had carried William through a lifetime of war was, in the end, the thing that failed him. He had always been physically formidable, tall for his age, thick through the chest, strong enough, the chroniclers boasted, to draw a bow from the saddle that other men could not bend on foot. In his prime, no one had unhorsed him. He had outlasted horses and enemies alike, riding harder and further than knights half his age, but the strength had turned to bulk. In his last years he grew enormously, almost grotesquely fat, his belly swelling until it strained against the saddle and made a labor of the riding that had been his whole life. He was still the most feared man in the West. He was also an aging, heavy, short-tempered king whose own flesh had begun to close around him like a cell, and the world, which had trembled before him for a generation, had started, very quietly, to laugh. The laughter came from Paris. Philip of France had grown up in the shadow of his terrible vassal, the Duke of Normandy, who was also King of England, a man richer and more dangerous than his own overlord, and Philip had learned to needle where he dared not strike. In the summer of 1087, William lay ill at Rouen, laid low, some said, by his own corpulence and the heat, unable for a time to take the field. And Philip, safe behind the walls of his kingdom, made a joke of it. The King of England, he said, was lying in like a woman after childbirth. The chroniclers who preserve the taunt vary in its exact words, and it is likely they polished it in the retelling, but its cruelty is plain enough. William, the great begetter of armies, reduced to a woman groaning in her bed, swollen and useless. The story goes that word was added of candles, that when this king rose at last from his lying in and went, like a new mother, to be churched, he would light such a mass of candles as France had never seen. If he did say it, it was a grim pun, for William's candles were already chosen, and they were the burning towns of the French border. The quarrel that would carry him to Mantes was not, in truth, only a matter of pride. The French Vexin, the borderland straddling the Seine between Normandy and the lands of the King of France, was disputed ground, and the garrisons Philip kept in its castles had been riding into Norman territory to burn and plunder around Evreux. William had demanded the region be handed to him. Philip had refused and sheltered his enemies besides. The mockery was the spark, but the war beneath it was old, and the king, who answered a joke with an army, was also a lord reclaiming a frontier he believed was his. It changed nothing about the method. Whatever the cause on the parchment, the answer on the ground was fire. Whatever the precise shape of the insult, its effect is not in doubt. William was a man who had burned cities for less than a slight to his dignity, and he answered this one in the only grammar he knew. He rose from his sickbed, not healed but driven, mustered what force he could, and in the high summer of 1087 he crossed into the French Vexin and fell upon the town of Mantes. He took it and he burned it. The chroniclers describe the churches going up with the houses, and Orderic records, with the horror of a monk, that among the dead were holy men, hermits and recluses who had walled themselves into their cells for God and were left to burn there as the fire swept the town. William rode through the ruins, surveying it with the cold, practiced eye of a man who had spent 30 years using fire as an instrument of policy. It was, in every particular, the method that had built his greatness. Terror applied without hesitation, a lesson written in ash for anyone tempted to mock him again. But the fire that answered Philip's joke was the last fire William would set. As his horse picked its way through the burning streets, the accounts differ on exactly how. The animal reared or stumbled on the hot embers and threw its heavy rider hard against the raised iron pommel of his own saddle. The blow drove into his belly. Something inside him tore. For a man of his bulk and his age, it was a mortal injury, though it did not kill him quickly. The man who had survived assassins in his cradle and 100 English swords on Senlac Ridge was undone, in the end, by his own horse in a town he had no pressing need to destroy. He was carried out of the wreck of Mantes in agony, and the campaign that had begun in wounded pride ended as a slow procession toward death. They brought him back toward Rouen, but the noise and press of the city troubled the dying king, and so he was carried up to the quiet of the priory of Saint-Gervais on the hill outside the walls. There he lingered through the last weeks of the summer, his great frame wasting, the pain never leaving him, tended by physicians who could do nothing and monks who could only pray. The wound was past their art, and they knew it. For some 5 or 6 weeks he lay dying by degrees while the summer burned itself out, lucid to the last, setting his affairs in order with the same cold method that had never left him even as his body gave way beneath it. Word went out across 2 lands that the Conqueror was dying, and the men who meant to divide what he left began, quietly, to gather and to reckon. And it was here, in the incense-heavy quiet of a dying man's chamber, that the chroniclers place the strangest scene of his whole life. The Conqueror, they say, looked back. The account we have is Orderic Vitalis's, written decades later, and it must be handled with care. Orderic gives William a long formal deathbed oration, a review of the whole reign, a confession, a disposing of the realms, and no honest telling can pass it off as the verbatim words of a dying king. It is a literary construction, the speech a monk historian composed and placed in his subject's mouth to make moral sense of a violent life, and much of it reads as the chronicler's theology rather than the king's memory. But it is not nothing. Orderic had spent his history praising William. The remorse he wrote into that chamber is the remorse he believed the deeds demanded, and the deeds were real. In the speech, the king is made to trace his life back to its beginning. The bastard boy at Falaise, forced to be a wolf among wolves, and then to the cost of the crown he had seized. He is made to confess that he had won England not by right but by blood, that he had persecuted its people beyond all measure, that he had driven the innocent to their deaths and raised his throne upon their bones, and he is made above all to speak of the north, the harrying, the deliberate burning of Yorkshire and the shires beyond, the slaughtered herds and the seed corn destroyed so that whoever survived the sword would starve through the winter, is given to him, in Orderic's telling, as the sin he could not set down. He does not, in the speech, plead necessity of state or offer the cold arithmetic of a ruler securing his borders. He is made to name it a horror, to say that he had fallen upon the English of the north like a ravening lion, that he had murdered a great multitude by famine as much as by steel, and that for the mountain of the dead he must answer to a God who does not forget. In the chronicler's telling, he trembles at the reckoning ahead, a man who had never in his life feared any earthly power, now afraid of the one court he could neither storm nor outwait nor buy. Whether one word of it ever passed his lips, no one can know. What we can say is that the man himself, in his last dispositions, behaved like someone trying to buy back a soul, pouring out treasure to churches and to the poor, ordering restitution, and, at the urging of those around him, reluctantly consenting to free the prisoners he had held for years, his own brother Odo among them, freed only at the pleading of others, and against the king's own plain judgment of what the man would do once loosed. There was the matter of the realms too, and even dying he could not make it clean. Normandy he left to Robert with the son who had unhorsed him at Gerberoy, because he had sworn it to him years before, and the Norman lords had done homage, though Orderic has him granted heavily, with foreboding, knowing exactly what his heir was. England he would not bequeath at all. He had not inherited it, he is made to say. He had taken it by no right of blood, but by force and the favor of God, and a thing so seized he dared not hand down, as though it were simply his to give. And so he commended the kingdom to God, and did no more than voice the hope that his second son, William Rufus, might have it, sending the young man across the channel at once before the death even came, with a sealed letter to Archbishop Lanfranc to be crowned, if God allowed. To the youngest, Henry, who would in the end outlast both his brothers and gather the whole inheritance into his own hands, he left neither land nor crown, but 5,000 pounds of silver, and the boy went straight off to see it weighed. He had won everything a man of his age could win, and he was dying in the knowledge of what it had cost. He had drawn the borders of a new world, and bound an island to a continent. He had also emptied the north and made a people foreign in their own country, and now, in the guttering candlelight of Saint-Gervais, the two halves of the ledger lay open together, and he could not close the book. The founder and the butcher were the same failing body on the same bed. Dying, he is said to have flinched at last from the memory of the north, but even his death would not grant him dignity. The end came not on a battlefield, nor in the great hall at Westminster, where they had crowned him amid flames 20 years before, but in the priory of Saint-Gervais on the hill above Rouen. It was the morning of the 9th of September, 1087. The man who had remade the face of Western Europe had wasted through the long weeks since Mante, the injury in his belly draining the strength from a frame that had survived assassins in the cradle and a whole nation's swords in the field. He was in his 60th year. In the last dark hours his mind stayed clear, and at first light the physicians and the clergy about him looked at him and knew the end had come, and told him so plainly that he might make his soul ready. As the light strengthened, Orderic tells, the king woke to the sound of the great bell of Rouen Cathedral tolling across the valley, and asked what it meant, and when they told him it rang for the hour of prime in the church of St. Mary, he lifted his hands, commended his soul to the Mother of God, and died. And in that same instant, the order he had spent his life imposing simply ceased to exist, for the machinery of his court did not mourn him. It disintegrated. The great men who had crowded the dying king's chamber, the moment they were certain the breath was gone, did not fall to their knees. They rose and rode, scattering to their own castles and their own lands, to arm the gates and secure what was theirs before the news could lose the chaos they all knew was coming. And behind them, into the emptying room, came the servants. They stripped it. They took the plate and the hangings and the arms and the vessels, and then, Orderic records with something close to disgust, they stripped the king himself, pulled the very garments from the body, robbed it of its linen, and fled with their arms full, leaving the mightiest man in Christendom lying half naked on the floor of a bare cell, unwatched and unwashed, as though he were a stranger dead in a ditch. Orderic, telling it, could barely contain his wonder at the reversal, that a king at whose nod the greatest men in two lands had trembled the day before, now lay untended and stripped by the least of his own servants, and that of all the thousands he had made rich, not one would stay to close his eyes. The most powerful corpse in Europe lay abandoned on the stones for the better part of a day, because the men he had raised had learned from him the one lesson he taught best, that when the strong man falls, you look first to yourself. The silence around him spoke plainly of what his reign had been. It had been held together not by love and not by loyalty, but by fear, and the fear died with the man. When word ran down into Rouen, there was no tolling for a father of his people, no weeping in the streets. There was panic. Men who had prospered under his peace now bolted their doors or gathered their goods and fled to the countryside, certain that the death of the king meant the death of the order he had clamped upon the land. Some hid what they owned, some carried it off. The wiser sort armed their households and waited for the storm to come. It was the plainest verdict imaginable on the peace he had kept, that the moment its keeper was gone, the men who had lived beneath it expected not mourning but ruin. The state, it turned out, had been only as strong as the single failing body that had just given out on a bed at Saint-Gervais, and with that body cold, the state guttered like a blown candle. In the end, it was the clergy who recovered themselves, shamed into it by the sight, and the Archbishop of Rouen who ordered that the king be carried to Caen for burial in the abbey of Saint-Étienne that he himself had raised. But not one of his sons was there to bear him. Rufus had already ridden for the coast and the crown of England. Robert was in exile among his father's enemies. The youngest, Henry, had gone to see his silver weighed and counted. It fell in the end to a country knight named Herluin, moved by nothing but private piety, to take the dead king in hand. He was no great lord, this Herluin, and he owed the crown nothing that his betters did not owe far more. But where the sons and the barons had every one of them found somewhere else to be, one obscure knight paid out of his own purse for the boatmen and the bearers, and saw the body carried down the Seine and brought at last overland to the abbey gates at Caen. It was the single act of plain decency in the whole grim business, and it came from a man whose name history would otherwise never have troubled to record. It was a poor cortege for such a man. The late summer heat pressed down, and the great swollen body, corrupting in the warmth, went ahead of itself by its smell, so that the passage of William through his own Normandy was heralded by the stench of his decay. And when the procession reached Caen at last, the town was on fire. A blaze had broken out among the close-packed wooden houses, and monks and mourners alike broke off from the procession to fight it, snatching at the flames while the bier stood waiting, so that the man who had answered a joke by burning Monte came home to his own funeral through a burning town, half his own right abandoned to the fire. It was as though the element he had used all his life to unmake other men's homes had come to keep him company at the last. When the fire was beaten down and the service resumed, the church was thin of people, the air still bitter with smoke, the corpse riper than ever on its bier. Then came the final indignity, and Orderic, our source for it, sets it down without mercy. As the bishops moved to lower the body into the stone sarcophagus prepared for it, they found the coffin too short. Whether the masons had cut it wrong, or whether no one had reckoned on how far the corpse had swollen, the thing simply would not fit. It was a small failure of workmanship, the kind of thing a mason might have put right in an afternoon on any ordinary grave, but there was no putting it right here, not in a smoking church, over a rotting king, with the mourners already edging toward the doors. And the men about the grave did not stop. They bent to the body and forced it, pressed and shoved at the shoulders to drive the king down into stone that was too small for him, and under the weight of their hands the swollen corpse burst. The sound of it carried in the vaulted quiet. And then the smell. A wave of concentrated corruption so foul that the incense could not touch it, rolling out across the congregation until men who had stood unflinching in the presence of kings and on the fields of war turned and gagged and broke for the doors, robes clutched to their faces, emptying the church of the man they had come to honor. No censor could master it, and no discipline could hold the crowd. The great and the humble broke and ran together, until the church that had been raised to his glory stood all but deserted, its doors flung wide to the smoke of the burning town. The priests rushed through the last words of the rite and fled after them. It was the truest measure of him, in the end, that his own burial could not be borne in the same room as his body. There had been one more interruption, before the bursting, that cut nearer the bone than any stench. The Mass had been sung, and Gilbert, Bishop of Evreux, had stood over the bier to praise the dead king, and to ask the gathered crowd, in the old form, to forgive him whatever wrong he had done them, and to pray for his soul. It was meant as a formula, a courtesy owed to any great man laid to rest. But one man in the church took the bishop at his word. As the burial was about to begin, he rose from the crowd, Asselin, the son of Arthur, a local man of no rank and no power, and forbade it. He stood before the open grave and cried out, so that the whole church could hear, that the ground they meant to bury the king in was his. This land, he said, had been his father's. William had taken it by force, without payment and without right, to build this great abbey to his own glory, and now they would lay the thief to rest in the very soil he had stolen. He forbade them to bury the Conqueror in another man's earth. And the bishops, reeling and desperate to be done, did not argue the point. They found the claim to be true. They paid him 60 shillings, the chroniclers say, for the plot of the grave, with a promise of more for the rest of the ground. A hurried transaction over an open coffin, buying the dead king 6 feet of the land he had seized, because he had no honest claim even to that. So they put him in the ground at last, in a church filling with smoke and emptying of mourners, in a grave bought back from one of his victims, in a coffin that had broken his body to receive it. He had spent his whole life gathering land, acre upon acre, manor upon manor, a duchy, and then a kingdom, until he held an entire nation in his fist. He had founded a dynasty that would endure for 1,000 years, and built an engine of government that would outlast the memory of his crimes. He had been a force of nature, a hammer that shattered an old world to raise a new one on the pieces. The Bayeux Tapestry would carry his triumph down the centuries in bright wool. The chronicles would set his laws and his conquests down in careful Latin. The great abbey he had raised would keep his tomb, and none of it followed him into that chapel at Caen. The Conqueror had taken a kingdom, a nation, and 100,000 lives, and in the end he could not keep even the 6 feet of ground they tried to bury him in. The ledger of William's life is written in 2 inks, and it is not possible to read one without the other. Set down the first, and it is the record of a founder without equal in the history of the island. Before him, England was a rich and ancient kingdom, but a fragile one, a patchwork of great earldoms that pulled against the crown, a prize fought over for a century by Danish and Norwegian kings, a land that had been conquered once already in living memory and could be conquered again on any autumn tide. William ended that. He welded the earldoms into a single realm, answerable to one man, and he clamped upon it an administration so formidable that its shape can still be traced in the English state today. The long Viking centuries closed in his reign and did not reopen. The last great Scandinavian armament, gathering in Denmark in 1085 to take England back, dissolved before it ever sailed, and the age of the northern sea kings was simply over. He turned the island's face from Scandinavia toward the continent and bound it there, in language and law and lordship, for good. And he left behind, in the Domesday book, the most complete and ruthless act of statecraft the medieval West ever produced, a kingdom counted down to the last ox and the last plough, and governed accordingly. He remade its church as thoroughly as its government, setting the great scholar Lanfranc over Canterbury, moving bishops' seats into the cities, calling the reforming synods that dragged the English church into the wider currents of Latin Christendom, and he bound the whole edifice to himself. At Salisbury, in 1086, he gathered the landholders of England and had them swear their loyalty to him over the heads of their own lords, so that no baron's power could ever stand between the king and the men who held the land. It was a structure of extraordinary strength, and it held. The stones remain to prove it. The White Tower still stands over London. The cathedral at Durham still rides its rock above the river. Across England and Normandy, the great Norman arches carry the weight of 900 years, and they carry it easily, and the line he founded never broke. Every sovereign who has worn the English and then the British crown from that day to this descends, by one road or another, from the bastard of Falaise. The coronations, the successions, the whole long pageant of the monarchy runs back, unbroken, to a man forcing his way ashore at Pevensey. 9.5 centuries of it, the civil wars and the reformations, the union of the crowns, the reach of empire and its slow unwinding, all descend from that single autumn crossing and trace their legitimacy through the bastard they buried at Coin. By any measure, his own violent age could apply. Courage, discipline, the sheer capacity to impose a will upon the world. William was effective as almost no ruler before or since. That is the first ink, and it is not a lie. The achievement is genuine, and it is enormous. But turn the page, and the second ink is blood, and it will not wash out. The title we have given him is the softest word in the language for what he actually did. Conqueror. It calls up a single clean afternoon, a field, a fallen king, an arrow, a crown changing hands, and it hides everything the conquest actually required. For England was not won in an afternoon at Hastings. It was taken over 5 years by fire and famine and terror, and then held for a generation by a machinery of fear the island had never known. The same hand that raised the White Tower raised it to overawe the city beneath it. The castles that studded the country were not shelters for the people but fists planted in their towns. And beneath every achievement on the founder's side of the ledger lies the same iron that drove the burning of the North, for the efficiency of William's government was never anything but the administrative shadow of the efficiency of his violence. That violence has a name, and it is not one the sanitized legend likes to say. In the winter of 1069 into 1070, to end the risings in the north once and for all, William did not merely defeat the northern shires. He erased them. He burned the villages and slaughtered the herds and put the seed corn and the tools to the flame, so that whoever the sword had spared would meet the winter with nothing, and the roads of Yorkshire filled with the starving and the dead. Even Orderic Vitalis, who had spent a lifetime writing the king's praises, could not follow him there. When his history reached that winter, his pen faltered, and he wrote that he dared not commend so brutal a slaughter, that he could find nothing good to say of it, and that the just judgment of God would surely fall on the man who ordered it. How many died, no one will ever know. The 100,000 of the chronicles may be a true reckoning or a medieval figure for a horror beyond counting. But the killing left its own record colder than any chronicle. 16 years later, the king's own survey went through those same shires and wrote against manor after manor a single flat Latin word, vasta est, it is waste, the terse verdict of William's own government upon what William's own army had done, and the north was only the sharpest edge of a wider erasure. Within 20 years of Hastings, the English ruling class had, quite deliberately, ceased to exist. The old aristocracy was killed in battle, driven into exile, or reduced to holding as tenants the very lands their fathers had owned outright. By the time of Domesday, scarcely an English name remained among the great landholders of England. A whole people had been made foreign in their own country, ruled in a language they did not speak, judged by lords who lived behind castle walls, cut off even from their ancient woods by a forest law that could blind or maim a man for taking a deer where his grandfather had hunted freely. Nor was it only the lords of the land who were swept away. The same tide ran through the church he had reformed. Within a generation, the English bishops and abbots were gone too, replaced almost to a man by Normans and other foreigners, until the aged Wulfstan of Worcester stood nearly alone as an Englishman among the prelates of England. The English did not stop existing, they stopped mattering. They became the ruled and the tongue of the conquered, and for 3 centuries English was the speech of those who had lost, while the men who governed them thought and prayed and gave their orders in French. The truest verdict on him was written by an Englishman who had lived under him, in the obituary the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle set down when the news of his death came home, and its power is that it refuses to choose. This was a stern man, the chronicler wrote, and a violent one, who let the poor groan beneath him, who gathered gold and silver and cared not how sinfully it was got. And in the same breath, grudgingly, the same hand admitted the other half, that William kept such firm peace across the land that a man might travel its length with his bosom full of gold and come to no harm, that no one dared strike another, however great the wrong. Both of these were true at once, written by a man with no reason to flatter him. The order was real. So was the fear that bought it. That is the whole of William, in the words of one of his victims, a peace worth having and a price no one should ever have had to pay. There is no way in the end to separate the founder from the man who broke the North. They are not two figures who can be prized apart and judged in turn. They are one hand, and the crown it forged and the graves it filled were made in the same motion. The very qualities that made him a great king were the qualities that made him a great destroyer: the iron will, the refusal ever to leave an enemy standing, the readiness to do the unbearable thing first and without flinching. There is no William who keeps the founder's gifts and sheds the harrower's crimes, because they were the same gifts, turned now to building and now to burning. The discipline that raised Domesday was the discipline that emptied Yorkshire. The line of kings that descends through 9 centuries, through the slow growth of law and parliament and everything the English came to be proud of, sits on a throne that William built. It also sits on the bones of Yorkshire. Every English monarch since has reigned on the foundation he laid, and that foundation is both the governed, unified, enduring kingdom he made and the deliberate ruin he made it out of. Neither cancels the other. To keep only the triumph is to tell a lie by omission that we have told comfortably for 900 years. To keep only the atrocity is to pretend the achievement away, and it will not be pretended away. So we are left where the story began, in the church at Caen, with the smoke and the broken coffin and the unbearable smell, and with the one man in that congregation who told the truth out loud. He rose over the open grave to say that the very ground they were burying the king in had been stolen, that the great abbey stood on land taken by force from his father, and that the Conqueror had no honest right even to the earth of his own tomb. They paid him to be quiet, and they buried the king in the ground he had seized, and the legend closed over the scene like water. But the man had said the truest thing spoken all that day, and it is the truest thing to say of the whole reign. William took a duchy, and then a kingdom, and then a nation, by being more willing than any man alive to use force and to use it first, and history has thanked him for it with the kindest word it owns. We call him the Conqueror. It is the polite name for the method, and the method was terror. And the terror bought a throne that has never once, in all the centuries since, stood on anything but the ground he took and the dead he made to take it.